There's a real Highland landscape, and it's a landscape of the imagination. What we imagine, if you read the tourist brochures, it always comes the wild Highlands, fantastic landscape, unspoiled wilderness, etc. That's a landscape of the imagination, like, or the expat as well, perhaps, as diaspora. I'm looking at what's happened on the ground, mainly in the last 200 years. So the writing on the pictures, if it's a bit small, don't worry, it's made an aid memoir for me. But the picture on the left, if you look carefully, you can still find what I call the old tradition in Scotland, the Scotland of imagination, the Highlands of imagination, the unspoiled wild land. And it's got an unbroken link back to the Ice Age. Nobody, since the world began, has come along and said, heather should be there, peat bog should be there, grass are there, mountain plants up there. And there's not many parts left of the world, particularly Europe, where that's still the case. It's undesired. And the soil's never been disturbed, never been ploughed, like agricultural land, for forestry, or for agriculture. So it's a pretty undisturbed landscape, and that's still, I think, the untrammeled Highlands of imagination.
It's a bit boomy.
A bit boomy. I think that's probably because the volume of the microphone,
yes,
or the speaker's quite high. What I'm not talking about is the area around the settlements. There's been a huge history of occupation around settlements and around fields where people do agriculture. That's a typical Highland view. It's actually after the buoy, and there's a huge amount of modification to grow crops in my land, and tree planting and things and gardens. I'm not talking about the area around the settlements. I'm talking the majority of the landscape, which is the hill land beyond. The hill land in the background, you can see that. So I'm not going to talk about the detailed history of settlement. I'll bear that in mind. I'm generalizing about the uplands. And I think there's a common perception, sometimes you hear about in the Highlands, well, the Highlands have always had a population that had been depopulated. The clearances came along, cleared the people off the land, and it shouldn't really be people everywhere because people, the bad landowners in the clearances. Well, that's very simplistic. There were huge tracts of the Highlands which have never been inhabited, never managed, never used. Haldane, in his excellent book, The Drove Roads of Scotland, said that when cross-country cattle droving started, a great part of the Highland and upland areas was common land, at least land which was normally owned by the local clan chief, was in fact unused and uncared for. Most of the Highland landscape was never used or managed. Some are shearings of cattle in some of the glens, but not everywhere. Hunting for deer, obviously, and maybe hunting for game. And the really excellent book by Tom Devine, the recent one of the Scottish clearances, he says, when modern visitors contemplate hills and glens which are empty of people, they should not assume that they were inhabited in the past. Now he's one of eminent historians, and I think we should take what he says seriously. So when you hear about, well, the hills have always been populated, they're not really wild because people used to live there. True in some places, but there's huge tracts of land which have never been populated, never been managed, and it's probably true wild land. So now I'm going to talk about how the landscape has changed. And I'm going to start actually with one or two maybe ancient changes, more than 250 years ago. And the biggest landscape change has probably been taken by peat cutting. Because there haven't been any trees in the Highlands for thousands of years. There's always been peat. And if you think of some of the islands, unwooded islands, you couldn't survive in the Scottish climate, as we've had the last few weeks, if you haven't got a source of heat. And peat was the main source of fuel. So peat cutting has been going on since people inhabited the land. The top picture, it's in Shetland, but it just shows the whole land hillside with peat cuttings, and all over the Highlands and this part of the world, you can see old peat cuttings. And if you think about it, if a house needs 300 tons of peat a year, wet weight, it's over the time scale. If there's a population of 100 people live for 1,000 years, they can strip whole landscapes of peat, as has happened. The top left hand of Eriskay, at the bottom end of the Long Island, and it's often not a bare rock showing. And you know, they're very poor, the peat bog. And once you've cut all the peat from the peat bogs, you start mining the tar, which actually is hiding to nothing because then you lose anywhere to grow crops or graze your animals. The top right picture is actually an oil picture from years ago of Fair Island in the Shetlands, Ward Hill. And this whole hillside was peat covered, and it's all been cut off. This would have been under maybe 2 or 3 meters of peat over the last, been cut over thousands of years. And the only reason the people on Fair Isle can survive, there's only one peat bog left, peat cutting on Fair Isle, is because modern heating is coming, oil and gas and electricity. But there's a lot of history of depopulation of islands in Shetland because the peat ran out and they couldn't survive on the island. And on Ringulay, they had to go by boat to a neighbouring island of Pabe to cut their peat. So imagine the whole landscape, probably there's been a more landscape change of humans transforming the landscape through peat cutting than through woodland loss. But more on that later. In fact, I'm talking about the landscape, talking about the landscape change the last few hundred years, but I'll go back a few thousand years. The top picture, as in Glentorridon, shows a peat bog, or blanket peat, with trees. You can see tree stumps, whole trees blown over on the side. And those obviously, it probably blew out from an easterly wind about 4,000 years ago. Most of the peat bogs, most of the tree stumps we've seen peat bogs for 4,000 years, and range from maybe 2 to 6,000 years old. And it's a complicated story because here we see a peat bog in the one layer, and you've got peat underneath, you've got tree stump, and then peat on top. That implies that there are no trees, then trees colonised and it disappeared again, all without the influence of people. And modern research shows that, I could spend a whole talk on woodland history. Modern research shows that most of the highland woodlands disappeared naturally, and the ancient pinewood fragments at Stratharron on the right we see are the end point of the long-term natural decline. You probably can't see this diagram very clearly. This is the southernmost fragment of native pinewood and left in Scotland, Glenfallow, has been attempts to regenerate it. But I said that the woodlands declined naturally from the maximum extent in what's called the mesocratic phase of post-glacial succession. And then ran, as would be expected, with the current oligocratic phase. I'm going to put this in and talk about this only fleetingly, because it's not the main subject of the talk. But in the glacial period, the climate warms up, you get the mesocratic phase, richer soils, highest tree cover, then the soil leaching results in poorer soils and woodland decline and more acidic soils. And this has happened in ice ages, between ice ages without people. It's a natural cycle. Now there's lots of stuff you read, but no evidence in fact. Like all the trees disappear because of sporting estates or too many deer or sheep farming or timber extraction. There's an interesting story. There's an English poet, Taylor the water poet, visited Marlodge Estate, or Marlodge, in 1618. And the Earl of Mar, so the ancient woods, there were still the same wooden fragments there today were there in 1600. Things changed slowly. They go so far away from any passage of water and withal in such rocky mountains that no way to convey them is possible, either with boat, horse or cart. These woods, he said there's enough trees there to put masts on the whole fleet of the English fleet, or the Scottish fleet, but they no economic use to them, so you couldn't extract them. So you couldn't extract the timber in the Highlands because there was no roads, or no, except by the coast. And the one exception is Speyside, where you float the wood down the Spey to the shipbuilding yards at Kingston and Garmouth. So, but that's the point. You couldn't extract the timber without roads or getting them out. This inland, by the sea, was different. And if you look at the Roy maps, at the end of the Battle of Culloden, you know, the whole system changed in the Highlands of land ownership and land management. But he mapped the whole of the Highlands, and this is a typical Roy map from Loch Murner, And the only woodland present in 1750, a lot of the fragments are there and they're probably still there today. So I talked earlier about the Highlands being uninhabited and pretty wild, and woodland declined to this very low level of 4%, way back before land ownership came into being after the end of the clan system. And when the wolf was present, because wolves remove deer around, and people say if you introduce a wolf, it'll kill the deer, and there'll be less deer and there'll be more trees. Well, the woodland disappeared when there were both deer and wolves. So there's 10,000 years evidence shows it likely to be true. And they were this low level of woodland before sheep farming. You couldn't have free-range sheep farming, and the wolves were the landscape. And they come on, in the old days, sheep were wintered indoors. A very few numbers, and few cattle, because you couldn't keep them over winter, wasn't enough food. So the amount of grazing wasn't high, and there was before sporting estates, before sheep farming, and before commercial timber extraction. The woodlands were very low in number. So I think that is a key point. So that was really, in other words, the woodland loss happened way before 250 years ago. So the rest of the talk is really looking at the more recent changes that have taken place. And only after the Battle of Culloden did the Highlands begin to show significant landscape change, because it went from a clan system, and the clan chief, the clan system was more interested, you could argue, in fighting each other and stealing cattle, and it was a cattle-based system. And they didn't see the land as a source of income. When land ownership, after the Battle of Culloden, the breakup of the clan system, the traditional landowning system you had in England and other parts of Europe came to the fore, and owners wanted to make money from their land. So straight away you have a different perspective. But you couldn't make money from the land if you couldn't get to it. So the beginning of the end of the traditional Highland landscape was opening up of transport networks. On the left is the Wade Bridge, Daviot, Benay, and the lower is the old bridge, the old High Bridge at Glen Spean, the Spean Bridge, the original Wade Bridge. So the military roads were built after Culloden, after the first Jacobite uprising. And all the roads he built were designed for military uses, not for civilian use. They weren't always very practical. But they also quite good for the Jacobites who could use them to get their troops around as well. It's a two-edged sword in some respect. It's only with the parliamentary roads under Telford, and I don't know if you've read the books by Josie Mitchell, Reminiscences of Building Roads and the Culloden Canal in the early 1800s. Act of Parliament, and the roads in the Highlands were built. It was a public-private partnership, 50% funded by the landowner, 50% by the state. And there wasn't much practice in road building, and various landowners went bust, and contractors went bust, and the croppers would all go away during the potato harvesting season or peat cutting, so they weren't there to build roads. It's an interesting story, but the roads were built in the end. So straight away from now on, you could start having coaches by horse from London to Edinburgh, and instead of taking days to get down to the central belt, so weeks or days. And because after the roads came the railways, and the canal, the Caledonian Canal, and the railway system. A lot of railways in the Highlands at the Manning Line were built, as for economic development purposes to encourage the export of goods from the Highlands. And once you got roads, people came in, tourists came in with railways. And the Victorians, you could get from London to Inverness in a day, so 3 weeks. And so people would come, and all the shooting estates then became practical, because people would come up to the Victorian shooting lodges in a day. And you can see other infrastructure in the old traditional stone arch bridges, which we could argue have more aesthetic appeal than the ones are the brutal concrete structures. And improvement of infrastructure is continuing, like during the A9. It hasn't quite reached the 82 yet. And with the land ownership, it's the beginning of what I call the compartmentalization of the Highlands. When sheep were introduced, on a large scale as a way of income for the landowner, they built fences and dikes. Those who've been hill walking have probably seen old sheep post and wire fences way up to about 3,000 feet, right at the tops of the mountains. They separated each landholding with fences for the sheep. They didn't last very long. They're all decaying away now. And there's an untold story there, because these cast iron posts are heavy. The wire is heavy. You've got to lead solder to get them into the rock, which means having, taking out lead solder, drilling into rock with a cold chisel. A huge amount of work. So with the Victorians, everything was possible. There's a real untold story of all these fence building, and sometimes dikes. And that one, on the dike at the top is about 2,000 feet up in Bentley, above Glenorchy, and this fence has been built to this day. So that you're beginning to see break the landscape up into compartments, and this is the modern approach. And it's continuing all the forestry planting going on, forestry plantations, rewilding schemes, land ownership boundaries, keeping animals on roads. And the traditional Highland road was unfenced. Now it's hard to find an unfenced road. People worry about deer's road safety with deer and running into it. And the miles and miles of fencing being put up in the Highlands, you wonder if it will ever be removed in the same way that the sheep farming fences were never removed. And when people get grant schemes of forestry, they get grants for putting in the trees, they never think about what happens at the end of the fence's life, how to get the fences out again. So there's lots of wire tagging up things to belong into the future. Well, I think that's my opinion, anyhow. And when sheep farming and sporting estates have started, you can now get to the Highlands. So they built roads up into the glens where there were no roads before, and built shooting lodges. This is actually now been pulled down. This is the one south of Loch Killin, the northern edge of one of the other mountains. And also, what's interesting, there were not many footpaths other than between settlements. But the stalkers wanted access up into the corridors to get at the deer, so they built stalking paths. So this made it easy to get up into the hills with pony carrying wood to carry the deer down, or for walking up with the guns. So it's beginning of a landscape to no paths at all. It's trackless, roadless and pathless. But now with easy access, you could say that footpaths and stalking paths is the beginning of the de-wilding of the Highland hills. And with sporting estates comes land management, particularly the eastern heather moorlands, grouse moor management. And the main landscape impact is strip burning of heather, or rotational burning of heather. And this, it's a visual intrusion into the landscape. You can see the obvious hand of man, where it wasn't before. But it's not irreversible. I think it's important to realise that these East Coast heather lawns, that's above Braemar, that's similar in Eastern Candles, it'd still be heather. They're ancient landscapes of heather. There'd be heather whether you burn them or not. To stop it burning, you could restore the landscape just like that. And so it's not a permanent, irreversible damage. It adds a diversity of colour, adds a diversity of habitat. To all heather, you get short heather or tall heather, you maybe get more birds and more plants. But you go, it's not a natural pattern. But it's not an irreversible change, it's like some of the ones that we mentioned. And of course, forestry is the biggest probably impact on the Highland landscape. With the labbing of the land ownership, and very before the end of the clan system, the Duke of Atholl started planting trees in the Atholl estates a long time ago. But with it, people going abroad, bringing back alien conifers and non-native conifers, like spruce and western hemlock and large trees. There's been a long tradition of planting by some of the bigger estates of the Southern Highlands. But when the Forestry Commission began in 1919, because they realised during the First World War that Britain needed a strategic reserve of timber. So they did massive planting, and it's still going on to this day. The Scottish Government has a target of 25% of Scotland under trees. If you think that natural percentage is 4%, and if you think trees are not going to be planted on the agricultural lowlands because they're too valuable for food. They're not be planted on the deep peat bogs because they're too valuable for carbon. Not be valued in the high mountain tops because it's too extreme climate, or right on the west coast where it's too windy. But most of the rest of the highlands are probably potentially going to be under forestry if nothing changes. I'll say a bit about forestry. Nowadays it's all Sitka spruce because it grows well on this climate. It's suited to the climate, suited to the soils, and it grows fast. It produces timber nice and straight, which you can get to market. It does all blow down in strong winds. It's a windy climate, so you can't let the trees grow on forever. They'll just blow over. And I think a lot of the new native woodland schemes being planted with trees close together will suffer the fate of a lot of the bottom, just blow over and become a mess. And it's an industrial process. There's nothing really environmentally sensitive about modern forestry. You might know this is actually a Loch on the way to Tydrum. That's a whole new bulldozed forestry road they put in about 3 or 4 years ago. It's all massive bulldozed tracks, hardcore big quarries, metal bridges, extraction by timber, by machinery. It provides what you can say about forestry. If you need timber, if a country needs timber, it's good for producing timber, quite low-grade timber, mind you, and it provides jobs, not necessarily locally, but it does provide boost the economy. But in terms of landscape change, it's completely destroyed, you could argue, the biodiversity and wildness of the Highland landscape. And this is a modern landscape. This is looking down on Loch with the main 85 going through the bottom there, up towards Tydrum. And all the lower slopes are planted with trees, and even over some of the higher slopes. The natural landscape would be the brown moorland. And this is the landscape we created, and we're producing actually parallel road networks. No collected timber lorries on roads, so you end up with whole new road systems off, going through the forest to sort of connecting up into massive private networks of forestry roads. Nothing very wild about that, but it's the way of the world. This is an ancient pine wood above Glenorchy, because there are a few fragments of original pine forest. Though it declined almost to extinction, not all of it disappeared, there's a few bits left. And that is, the trees around the edge there are all Sitka spruce plantation. And this is the relict pine wood stuck in the middle. The policy was, let's not damage the pine wood by planting the spruce, but we plant all the way around it, so that woodland has nowhere to breathe. But what is happening is that there's a big, huge movement. There's two kinds of forestry or woodland expansion. One is the commercial, which I've just gone through. The other is new woods of native trees. This is in Westeros, that's by Gairloch. Now, modern pollen analysis and research shows this area has not been wooded for about 4,000 years, and the woodland started declining here about 7,000 years ago. So trees have been planted in landscapes which haven't been wooded for thousands of years. And there's these all over the Highlands. This is Kingairloch, that whole landscape planted with a mixture of native birch and pine, probably. Because now these are viewed by the book, and probably if you ask them, brown, holly, and alder and wet bits put in as well. So this is causing major landscape change. But Glen Nevis is a whole new plantation below the memorials. Glen Nevis, those are little young pine trees coming up, with broad leaves thrown in. This is Darver Moor, the east coast heather moorlands, and around the north fringe of the Cairngorms. That's heather moorland, which will be, that the whole hill we can see has been planted with Scots pine. What's interesting, as an ecologist, is that heather moorland, the red grouse ecosystem, is only found in Britain. It's found nowhere else in the world. The Scots pine is probably the commonest tree in the northern hemisphere. You could call it the Vladivostok pine, if you wish. It goes all the way to Vladivostok. So we're replacing the globally rare habitat type, which is heather moorland, with the globally common woodland type, which is Scots pine woodland. And the heather moorland is all recognised as important under the Habitats Directive. The EU Habitats Directive is internationally important. Not the members of the EU anymore. Another one going up, if you've got the road between Kinloch Rath and Aberfeldy, that's another hillside. It used to be a sheep farm about 20 years ago, planted up, native broadleaves, maybe birch, maybe pine as well. Another one above Glen Doherty, and some of them, as all the trees died. There's one I know, what is built as the biggest woodland plantation in Britain, between Galloch and Marie, and about 90% of the trees are dead. The whole landscape, the soil has been disturbed by a digger making holes for planting, which is then none of the trees have survived in most of the area. It's very good for tadpoles, actually. Tadpoles like it. But as a taxpayer, it's our money which paid for it all. And these trees are all dying off. The Scots pine planted in the wrong place. You know, this is, and to plant trees, you dig holes in the ground and you plant trees on the turf, because our soils are not good for planting trees, not for growing trees, which is why they're not there in the first place. So you've got to break through to the iron pan, break through to the minerals on which have been washed underneath, so the roots will go down. So you dig a hole and you plant trees on the mound. It's called mounding. But it does release all this carbon stored in the soil to the atmosphere, which then oxidize away, and not particularly good for the climate. And unfortunately, I mean, the forestry ploughing has come back. In the old days, they discovered you had to plant trees to grow successfully. You had to break up the soil, break up the iron pan, get the nutrients below back to the surface, and whole hillsides were planted with deep forestry ploughs. That disappeared. In the last 5 years, it's come back a bit. This is another whole area of Dartmoor Moor, taking a plough over the whole landscape. Any archaeology, any vegetation patterns, any natural plant communities will be destroyed. It's a bit like scallop dredging. Everybody doesn't like scallop dredging. Well, but scallop dredging isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes the seabed can recover. But forestry ploughing, you can never recover that landscape. You permanently change the soil structure. Even if the trees disappear, then the landscape of ridges and furrows. And close to home, the one on the top right was deep ploughing recently. Above Loch Nell is the back of Oban. The hill above Lahore, just before you go to Castle Brander, that was all forestry ploughed about 5 years ago. And originally got the A9 between, well, just north of, between Barathol and down the Spittle. The whole hillside there has just been ploughed up, and trees are tree planted. Now you can't, this is, to me, this is irresponsible. I can't see. If you want trees, it works. If you're concerned about the landscape, it's an unmitigated disaster. It's important about knowing what your objectives are. At the head of Glenorchy, just before you get going up the back road up Glenorchy to Bridgenorchy, the whole hillside there has been mounded and planted. What's interesting, the dark bits here, I showed where it's quite high organic content, a peaty soil. And peat is dead plant remains building up over centuries, thousands of years, and it takes carbon out of the atmosphere permanently. So deep peat doesn't start off as deep peat, it starts as shallow peat. So you want peat to be a carbon store. It's best actually to keep the shallow peat to grow deep. If you do that and plant trees on it, the trees will dry up the soil and liberate the carbon. It's the worst possible thing to do for the climate, in my view. And you can see here, under most plantation, tree roots dry up the soil carbon. You get very dry. This would have been a boggy ground, now it's very dry, because the tree's roots have taken the water out. As another unmentioned feature, it's been known for a long time that in the Arctic, where the climate's warming and trees are moving north, in northern Canada, and you're replacing white reflective snow with dark trees. So that absorbs radiation rather than reflecting it, especially in winter, or winter and spring. So it results in localized warming and a feedback loop. Because trees are three-dimensional, they absorb lots of radiation and they result in warming. So there's more to the climate than just carbon. There's also the albedo, the reflectivity of the landscape. And this is actually above, to demonstrate, this is just above Glenorchy again. in this part of the world. And this again shows that. And that shows what you're replacing forestry plantation, in this case with purple moorgrass moorland, flying bent moorland. So it's not really talked about much, it's changing the reef activity. Trees might store carbon and take it out of the atmosphere, and they might warm the climate by absorbing radiation. The topic that's not talked about and needs a bit more research. So don't always immediately see that in the Scottish Highlands, that planting trees is always good for the climate. It's more nuanced than that. And of course, forestry extraction is now, you've all seen the mess of the Clairfell sites. You get huge machinery up, it churns up the soil hugely, and that's all releasing carbon as it dries out as well. And it's not a very beautiful site. But we should, you know, okay, those trees will be replanted after 5 years, it'll look better again. But it's not really, it's good for forestry practice in growing trees, but it's not very good if you want any aesthetic appeal or allow the landscape, the aesthetics. And finally, what happened, the future of the Highlands is visible in Galloway in southern Scotland. If you know Galloway, the Galloway Hills on the right there, the forestry plantation. It's a bit hard to see, but basically this is the landscape in 1925. There's Loch Ken, the Merrick is here, then Trood is here. So basically there's not much green on it. A few plantations in the Glen Kens. This is the landscape in 2018. Everything green. The bottom picture is where new forestry plantations have been put in. And that's really the fate of the Highlands, I think, if we carry on with the current progress. Well, that's forestry. I've talked quite a lot about trees because it's the biggest impact on the landscape change. We mustn't forget the infrastructure put in with the original hydro schemes. The first one was aluminium smelting, actually, above Loch Ness at Dawes. But this is the pump storage stream of Loch Glen, Croken, below Croken. And once you unlock to a reservoir, you get an ugly drawdown zone. This is Loch Cluny, when the water level is low. And reservoirs can be rather ugly in summer when the water level. You get this sort of artificial zone which is never vegetated because it's flooded some of the year, totally dry the next, and no plants can survive. You get pipes put in. You add infrastructure, and to get there you need roads and tracks. So that's a big change. After the hydro schemes, really, this is beyond the whole, ever since people colonised, they've been making land suitable for growing crops, just around settlements. But particularly in the 1950s and onwards, there were grants for land reclamation, as it was called. And the heather moorland on the top left has been converted to pasture. And a lot of the edge of the hills, what is now farmland and pasture, would have been moorland, heather moorland and people and wet heath. A less obvious change to most people, perhaps. And the bottom right, you might recognise that's the one of all at Dunad, the big people north of Crinan. And you've obviously taken out a chunk of peat and converted it to agricultural land. And this is the fate of most hill land in Britain, over Britain and peat bogs, because we need land for agriculture. And you dig ditches and things to drain the land as well as on the left. I've mentioned stalking paths, but it's a slightly smaller scale impact on the landscape. It affects people walking the hills. And this is interesting. This is a path. I'm not sure it's a stalking path, but you can see the zigzag here. There's a turn into a burn, it's a gully. They obviously built a path up there which hasn't been kept clear of water and turned it into a river or a burn. But you can see building these paths enabled the hunters and stalkers to get up into the hills. Nowadays it's hill walkers and the road riders and others. There's a picture of the Campbells below Orion Trek, and you can see the footpaths popular for walkers and climbers, making a scar on the land. It's a visual intrusion, not huge geographical area, but certainly it's not what was there before. And with tourism and the internet, this is the fairy pools in Skye. It's very hard to see if there's a new path built, because in the internet, so these pools here are fantastic pools. You must go there. So everybody did man and his dog. Huge traffic problems, parking problems. and they had to build a formalised footpath up to the ferry pool. But again, if you'd done that 20 years ago, it would have been a slog across bog and heath to get there, and not the same as it's an easy stroke. So we're making the access easier, put it that way. There's also the issue of footpaths, in that there's been an argument, it's like the National Trust of Scotland, and the National Trust of Scotland was given some properties like Glencoe by Percy Anna, and a condition of purchase was that the land should not be made easier to access, keep it wild. So if you're going to eroding footpath, this is anything up Ben Doran, I think, behind Bridge Walking, it erodes, and it's a bit of a scar and winding, and you can build a nice hard standing footpath to repair the scar. And there's a lot of discussion, does that make access to the hills easier? And therefore, is it against the spirit of other principles of keeping the land wild? Or is it a necessity in order to stop the landscape damage? I think that the jury now says it's better to stop footpath erosion and accept some making paths easier, just because otherwise they can get maybe like the top part of eventually gully erosion or turn into a whole pile of watercourses on an earlier picture. And then, of course, the vehicle, vehicular access. All over hills these days, people, state owners, take quad bike, the farmers, quad bikes as well, particularly common, ATVs, Arga cats. And the Scottish Highlands aren't designed for off-road vehicles. This is actually up Glencoe for deer stalking, for killing, culling the deer for natural nature conservation purposes, but it's getting to the peak, the watercourse, so you're not going to gully erosion of peak there, and this is a similar one used by crofters up in West Ross. And what older landowners do say, oh well, we've created all this damage, we've got to go up there, therefore we'll formalise it into a hard track, access track. So it is creeping industrialisation or taking over the landscape by vehicles. You create damage, therefore you solve the problem by creating a track, which has their own problems. And that's one at the back of Ben Schoolab, that's back of Ben Kruger and Lochetive, and this track has been bulldozed right over the hill down the other side. So imagine, I think in this case, it's for deer stalking purposes. And one or two of the course celeb, the track on the left was bulldozed by the Bath machine, West Ross. Eyesore, very visible, right under the hill. The landowner has since moved on, but it created a lot of furore in the Highlands about insensitive land management. And every hill now has bulldozed tracks up in for deer stalking and for grouse shooting. That's a gully back here, that's going to erode, and of course, all peat oxidation. And the disturbed ground at the edge of tracks actually as a conduit for invasive plants. So you change the soil, taking it back to post-glacial mixed conditions, richer, more fertile, so plants like this which enter the landscape. Every glen now has a little hydro scheme put in. That's above Kingairloch, because there'll be a dam at the top, a bulldoze track out to it, with a power station at the bottom. There's very few glens out left in the Highlands which don't have this. Wind farms, that's actually a picture of a farm from one of the others, taking an aeroplane. But you see that every wind farm needs a network of tracks connecting the turbines. Transmission lines, well, we take them for granted, pylons and phone masts, but they're all an intrusion into wild land, an intrusion into the landscape, which makes it more human taking over the land rather than as nature intended. And in a few localised, there's massive infrastructure in a few parts of Scotland, which is ski development, 5 areas. Good if you like skiing, but it's always a bit of a lost cause in Scotland. It always has been, because the climate's so variable. But you can't deny the fact that it's an introduction of machinery and infrastructure to wild hills. And that's Cairngorm. And the funicular railway, which has been a bit of a disaster from the word go. And then concrete monstrosity up into the hills, and all the ski lifts and fences and buildings, a huge car park in summer, and pick as it is in summer. I mean, economically it may be useful. I'm just pointing out, saying not a good or bad, this is the impact it is having. And wind farms, and there's people there for scale. You might just see 3 people there. Now, interesting, from a landscape point of view, you can always take down the wind turbine. Nothing irreversible about a wind farm. The turbine, you can take it away and restore it to, you know, a more natural-looking landscape. But the tracks, there's 500,000 tons of hardcore were taken up by Norway to build these tracks. There's huge concrete turbine bases in the peat under here, which you can't see. So if the wind farm, if you look forward 10,000 years, and the peat's all eroded, the wind farms are gone, like the tan traps along the Murray coast from invasion against in the Second World War, there'd be great concrete pillars scattered over that hillside. So you feel like you're closing down the options of future generations. They're going to inherit huge concrete rocks in that landscape, even if they can't see them now. Because they're never going to be removed. And this is actually the Far Wind Farm south of Inverness. That's as it was before the wind farm, as it was after. Now there's a certain aesthetic appeal to wind farms, don't get me wrong, we need renewable electricity. But it's a matter of whether they're appropriate everywhere. And these are the landscapes we're creating. The top one is above Lochall, Ben Crook in the background. Not rather hard to see at the back there. This is the Braes of Doon, the one above Stirling. And most of the, if you've driven around the M74 recently, most of the southern uplands now are wind farms. So it's landscape change. Do we want those everywhere? And wind farms need electricity generating. They need infrastructure like pylons. So they go together. And there's a lot of discussion about a huge new doubling the size of the pylons down the A9 as a renewable energy infrastructure. If it goes underwater, undersea, that's fine. New hydro schemes, the Glendow pump storage scheme above Fort Augustus was a new one about 10 years ago. But look at the impact on the landscape. This is up in the hills at 2,000 feet up. A massive great dam, and this is a peat bomb on the left, which is going to be flooded, which might affect the carbon in the long run. So hydro schemes aren't necessarily on low impact either. And this is a small one in West Ross off Garlock. The concrete dam, there's been no attempt to make it more fitting into an internationally important landscape. And this is in the Loch Lomond Crosses National Park, above the road that drove us in Inverora, up Glenfalloch. This is a national park, putting in an environmentally, benign hydro scheme. So-called environmentally benign. But, it's certainly there'll be some of that exposed ground will grow over. But it'll disturb soil, won't be the same vegetation. And there'll always be steep hills, sides of a track, which will be unvegetated, and that track will be there. And previously there was no track or road at all. So it's more encroachment into the hills of infrastructure and access. I was horrified to see even in Glentorridon, of Loch Marie, that's the back of Benet, going up in the background. And the river grew the hydro schemes, built a track way up into the hills here for a hydro scheme, and that's the Python Dam below Benet. And this is a national scenic area. It used to be a national park, it's a wildland area. And even if our most highly protected landscapes can't prevent some of the infrastructure, then it's not much anywhere else. And as to every single glen, this is just in Strathcarron, every glen now, you see the little hydro power station, and you pull those strapped way up to a dam and a pipe gun at the top. Whether it's a good or bad thing, whether you think it's necessary or to solve the climate change problem, or whether some areas should be kept wild, is a matter for society to decide. And also, this is what does happen. You see, this is disturbed ground by the generation by the Ball in Westeros. With fox, you can't really see at the back. Foxgloves coming in, dog leaves coming in, and gorse-bushel winds coming, mullen coming in. And this will colonise the trackside, and over time, introducing new species into the landscape. And I think this is And you can see it actually on the way from road improvement from the 1960s onwards around the Highlands. They've been conduits of invasion of gorse bushes or winds. The road to Liverpool, the whole length of 15, 20 miles, has taken gorse into that landscape. It was never previously present in that part of Scotland. And this is down the moor. No, this is Dromossimore, South Inverness. The whole landscape is covered with gorse, introduced by us as circle the ground, and then spreading outwards. Also lots of little things. Those are mainly big things. You see landowners taking diggers up into rivers and streams and building pools and riffles. This is on Jura, making the pool and down the soil there to make it better for fishing. Grouse boilers making pools for grouse. Trig points, you could argue, even that's an intrusion to wildland. Notices tree planting up rivers, little blocks. It's all changing the landscape. And landscape change is normally an accumulation of lots of changes, small ones, rather than one big change all at once. And I'll just finish with this other more insidious landscape change. Do you all recognise where the view is taken? I've driven past it many a time. Sorry?
The road from Cam
No, it's the back of Rest and Be Thankful. If you look at the on the western side of Rest and Be Thankful, and what is happening is that Sitka spruce were introduced into the landscape because they grow well and good for timber. But because they grow well, they take over and they leap off out of the plantation and spread over the landscape. There's even one right at the top of the hill now. And it is so, but in 100 years' time, imagine 10 times as many trees going up twice as high. And I think this insidious landscape change from the takeover by spruce will probably be the biggest landscape change in the Highlands in the next 200 years, but not something everybody's talking about. And I've talked to the Forest Commission about that, and say polluter pays. If you have a forestry plantation and your spruce are colonising the wider countryside, should you polluter pay, you should be responsible for removing them, but nobody's interested. And of course, Sitka spruce are native to Sitka in North America. They're not part of the Scottish biodiversity or landscape. You see the same with larch trees sometimes and hemlocks. Rhododendron we all know about. This whole hillside here is rhododendron. You've probably seen it at Loch Ness, Lochy, up there in Blarney. And this here is an isla. This is all more than this all rhododendron here, colonising more than an island. There's a new small more young plants growing there, here and here and here. So it is learned about, but the scale of the problem needs an order of magnitude more effort if you're worried about it than has ever been given to it. And over time, instead of our open hills and moorland, you'll have a mass of rhododendron impenetrable and Sitka spruce. And that's the way what we've done is causing ecological change to go. Not only those plants, Cotoneaster spread by birds is all over the cliffs, problem on Mull, some of the cliffs are around plants growing around moths. This is the cliffs above Ankara Gulf on Seal Island, and this pale colour here, that's what Cotoneaster was spread, covering the whole cliffs. Skunk cabbage is spreading, that's on, if you know, the car park fisheries on the Mull side of Ellen Ferry. There's a huge area of skunk cabbage spreading, and it's also colonising around the shores of Lochhalie itself, which is going to change. In time, it's going to take over all our coastlines. Looking ahead, if you know the road between Fort William and the Coronel Ferry, right above the Lochhalie car park, that whole hillside is covered with Himalayan honeysuckle, Lake Asteria. That pale green is all Himalayan honeysuckle. It's not talked about much, but it's a garden plant, and it does escape. It's a huge problem in places like New Zealand, for example. But these are all the problems we're storing up for the future. And it means it might be quite difficult to maintain traditional Highland landscape in the long term. So, to finish on, covering a lot of ground there, this is the Highlands of the imagination, I call it. The wild, unspoiled, scenic beauty bring all the tourists and make people want to live here and come here. The reality, I would argue, the still wonderful places like that is more here, the east side of the hall. It is all industrialised forestry, the wind farm at the top, rotational forestry, fish farm below. And the way government policy is going, again in Argyll still, this is the future of the landscape if nobody worries about it too much. There's a loch here, there's a loch Glasham, out of the loch somewhere, north of Gilphead. There's a dam here, dam loch, there's a drawdown zone on the loch when it's low. There's tracks everywhere, there's all foreign introduced trees and larch and spruce. Wind farm, there's a new wind farm being built, huge amount of access track. And only a bit of traditional Highland landscape. There's little bit left at the back now. So this is the direction we're heading. Is it the future we want? That's the question I'll leave you with. And thank you for putting with me for all this time. So a lot of ground covered there.
Are there any questions? I take it you're happy for questions? Yes?
Sorry?
You're happy for questions?
Oh, yes, if anybody wants.
Any questions?
Do you suggest any alternatives to planting trees, or just not doing anything? Can you repeat the
Yes.
question?
So the question is, do I see any alternatives to planting trees?
Yeah, what do you suggest as an alternative?
To achieve what?
To achieve, to preserve the natural landscape.
Well, if you think of what I said at the beginning, it managed to survive its key wild characteristics because it wasn't managed.
Okay, yeah.
So if you want to, it can't be rewild if it's wild already, presumably.
Okay.
Therefore, just do nothing except concentrate on removing things that shouldn't be there, like the Scottish Highlands, the rhododendron, or the spruce. And don't bulldoze tracks and let other plants come in. But the trouble is, if you're a conservation body, doing nothing is very difficult. You say, well, we want to show the world we need in the field and saving the planet. We want to be doing things, planting trees, digging ponds, storing carbon. If you're not doing something, how do you tell your members to join? You're just holding a bit of land and doing nothing with it. It does not very a good way of promoting membership, is it? But you could say the reason the National Trust for Stormont and others was set up was actually to stop, the National Trust of England was set up to stop coniferisation in the Lake District, keeping the landscape as it was. So I think conservation bodies need to get better at saying we're not going to do anything. Except, I just mean just in lowland Britain, independent of what you're speaking about, you couldn't generalise. In lowland Britain, which is all agricultural farmland, intensive, eutrophic farmland, and islands of natural habitat surrounded by intensive agriculture, then yes, do everything you can, join up and make habitat networks, plant trees, create natural habitats. But in the Highlands, it has a different ecological history. So you need to relate what you do to knowledge of the history of the landscape you're dealing with. And this isn't happening, in my view.
Those of us who are interested in regenerative agriculture are seeing ideas of bringing trees and other permanent vegetation into agricultural land, and that may be one of the alternatives if we can get it widespread enough, because bringing trees into where you're going to be grazing, into permanent food forests, into creating more opportunities in crofting land and the low ground land, that creates the habitat, the diversity, the trees. It benefits the pasture land, improves our soils, creates woodland that the livestock can use. Is that a possible? Do you?
Well, I think you've got to. The question was that if you've got regenerative agriculture and you're planting trees to improve the soils and regulate wildlife and things, that must be a good thing. Well, I think it depends. You've got to relate it to place. Mm-hmm. And there's three kinds, in my view, of conservation action. There's one, if it's been out as a rainforest, for example, leave it be. I mean, maybe let indigenous people stay there and do that with no impact. You don't start doing things to it. It's the same with the Highlands. If it's a bit of natural Highland landscape that's escaped the things I've talked about, leave it be. So that is the wilderness approach, letting it be wild. If it's a piece of landscape which is what I call traditional agriculture, and our traditional agriculture was not importation of fertilizers. You know, in the old days, like the Yorkshire meadows and the Yorkshire fields and the whole of Scotland, it was all manure-based, and you moved the nutrients around using manure. And that often can be more wildlife rich than the native thing it replaced, because it made the soils richer and more diversity. So if it's traditional agriculture, which is probably more what you're talking about, if it's been, if you want to, it's more a landscape issue, you can keep that traditional landscape, you can fit in with the landscape characteristics. If it's a modern intensive agriculture, you've lost any element of natural soils and vegetation and animals. So you would free hand do what you want. But be careful if you think, well, I'm going to restore the biodiversity by planting trees, and it was a landscape that never had trees, or disappeared 4,000 years ago. You're not restoring biodiversity, you add it to diversity. And the word diversity is quite a dangerous one, I think, because if you look at biodiversity at a global scale, global biodiversity means conserving the biodiversity of the planet at a global scale. And different parts are different. There's rainforests in certain tropics, there's Arctic tundra, there's boreal forest, there's northern in Scotland. And so keeping that range of natural habitat types, so keep the full range, and that means to keep the global diversity of habitats, some are going to be very poor in species and some are rich. So if Scotland is naturally poor in species, that's part of global biodiversity. So enriching it with species, you can't actually increase biodiversity by that definition because you inherit it from nature. You can restore it if it has been damaged, but you can't increase it. So if you are a bit of moorland, which is rather species poor, or a bit of farmland, which is species poor, if you're putting things back that weren't there originally, it may increase diversity, but it's destroying lower biodiversity at the local scale. And that's the distinction. People equate diversity with biodiversity. And I think it's a word that's it's so undefined that the word means all things to all people. You know what to do about maintain biodiversity, you take a pond and plant a tree. But if it's a part of Britain that never had ponds and never had trees, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. But it doesn't mean, if all the diversity has been destroyed because the land has been managed and there's nothing left natural, then it really is up to you to do what you want, to be honest, as long as you're clear what the objectives are. So at the back.
Thanks so much for a very interesting presentation. One of the things that interested me was the point you made earlier on about the loss of the natural forests that happened a long time ago. What I was curious to know was, in terms of positive, how many of these forests are still around in Scotland? Because I stay at a plot of farm in the back of Tyrconnell, and across the move from where I stay is Acton Caution Woodland, as part of Acton Cloyd Estate, might know, and it stretches for about 7 or 8 miles down the centre of Black Box. And that, I think, is a historical forest based on the species that are in there. And throughout my life, that forest has never really changed. I don't know whether active or not. It has been looked after over the years. But
well, the question was how much of the natural forest was remaining, because the place in Argyll where there's still quite a lot to be left. I think if you take the figure of 4% forest cover for Scotland as a whole, that means some parts with no trees at all. And the coastal Argyll, and the far west coast of Scotland, did hold on to more trees. And if you drive around Argyll at the moment, you actually see native forest expanding all over the place without any action. And that's because the soils are better of Argyll than further north and further east. The climate is better. And if you've got a warmer, mild climate, there's a summer grass growth all winter. And deer and animals don't need to eat trees, they prefer grass. If there's some winter-green material all winter, there's a greater probability of woodland survival. So along the coastal fringes of the best milder climate, you expect more woodland to survive, especially where the soils are better. In fact, a paper came out yesterday on this topic, and if interested, I can direct you towards it. But I think, yes, some parts of Scotland have quite a lot of woodland, but taken as a whole, 4%.
Just on that final point you made there, we referred also to the development of Loch and the plumbing was done. The work on the advertising for it claims that that's a national woodland that's been replanted. Now, I don't know if that was the case or not, but that's certainly the narrative was set.
The good source, go to the Roy Maps, the National Library of Scotland, have published all the Roy Maps online. Only the Highlands, not the Islands, unfortunately, also not the lowlands of Scotland. And that gives a very good indication of woodland cover as it was in 1750. That's your source. And the thing is that woodlands have expanded since then, and some have declined. And we humans have put so much woodland back in the landscape in the last 100 years. It's quite difficult sometimes to know what's natural and what we planted, and what we plant receives. And people talk about natural regeneration. But that's, to me, a bit of a misnomer, because grazing animals are part of the natural ecosystem. And having red deer over most of the Highlands is perfectly natural. So removing them to encourage trees is not natural regeneration, it's not a natural system we're creating. Because you want trees, you get rid of the animals to encourage trees. But the natural system might be the animals not that happy. So the word natural, again, can be a bit of a misleading one there, because people think animals are just an overlay of an ecosystem, rather than something that actually shape the vegetation pattern.
I don't really know, but I heard something about Reading Prairie Castles. One of the ancients of our time, so he talks about what those birds are. There were meant to be some different species of trees growing in the castle.
I don't know, does anyone know about the woodland history of Inverary Castle estate? No, I can't help you on that. Except that if you go back to the Roy Maps, see how many trees were there. But even then, you can maybe tell whether they were plantations, within regular boundaries, or randomly placed in the middle of nowhere, it could have been a plantation. So there's a question here.
I was just going to ask, is there anywhere that you would regard as in Scotland as being truly originally wild and untravelled by human beings?
Are there any areas of Scotland seen as originally wild? Yes, there's some quite large tracts that managed to escape all the tree planting, road building. I'm in the Torrid in Wester Ross. The Scottish Natural Heritage has got a map, what are called wildland areas. And they're the wildest areas. And if you look at that map on the Scottish, Nature Scots, our website, there's 42 areas of Scotland, which would be defined as wildland areas. But the trouble is, while we speak, there's a new hydro scheme being built up a track, a new track's being built, or new estate owners put this track up. So it's a changing target. And the question is whether a new woodland plantation with fences detracts from the wildness or not, is a subject of discussion. So an area without woodland plantations, there's some, but they're getting less common, as people increasingly see trees as the answer to everything.
Where does our Atlantic rainforest fit within that?
Well, where is the Atlantic rainforest? Well, I think that's a misnomer. A rainforest gives the impression of great forests through the landscape, like the Amazon, covering all of Central Africa, and the rainforest of Africa covering Central Africa. Rain woods, I prefer. They're localized, scattered around with suitable habitats, especially these cliffs to stop grazing. All of forests we better define rainforest. But everybody's talking about Celtic rainforest now. Conservation goes through phases of fashion like anything else. Like aspen becomes a new tree, we've been planting aspen everywhere. Everybody's talking about Celtic rainforests now. Well, it's a small percentage of the woodlands. So 40%, but they wouldn't be everywhere. They'd be along the coastal fringes and not far inland, because if you go inland, then there's less things for animals to eat, and the woods don't survive as well because there's less grazing in the winter. But certainly the Celtic, in Scotland internationally, what's Scotland internationally important for its wildlife towns? Well, there's your rare mosses and liverworts, which do come in some of these forests, but they also come moorland. The Torrid Mountains is the best example of what are called hepatic-rich heathwood. which is liverwort-rich moorland on the north coast, north side of Lagos in Torridon, of anywhere in the world. Then if you want an interesting little story, let's do a sad story. There's one liverwort which is found in some of these rare sites on moorland. Not sure if it's a woodland one. And there's only one sex in the population in Torridon, and the nearest one of the next sex is in California. So there's a chance of distribution. But the Celtic rainbow have been a fantastic placement, and we should look after them. But that gives a mindset that there should be woods everywhere. And I think one of the problems, if 4% of Scotland was natural, well, the Highlands was natural. Well, James Leakey, way back in 1866, was a geologist, and he said woodlands all disappeared naturally, and that was in 1866. We should have unlearned that since then. But if woodlands, I lost my thread there. Any other questions? Sorry, we better draw this to a close. One last question?
I think because of the global impact of climate change, we're never going to get away from this difference between the conservationists and their research, which continually changes in quite short periods of time as far as landscape is concerned, and then battle with the land management side. It's just, how do you get out of it? And then if you bring in a change of government as well every so often, and maybe an independent Scotland.
Yes, the question is, there's governments changing and policy changing, and climate change considered, and biodiversity, and how to decide what is priority. I think society has to decide. We could cover the whole of the Highlands with wind farms and dam every burn, because renewable energy is low density. I mean, fossil fuel is high density, nuclear is high density. If it's low density energy, you need a lot of infrastructure to get it out. And we could decide to cover it all with wind farms. And that's a societal decision. Do you want, I mean, as I see it, one of the characteristics of us human beings is taking over the whole planet. Everywhere we go, you see the hand of man and the hand of humans. And there's roads, there's tracks, there's masts, there's plantations. And it's quite nice to know that some parts of the world where you can go with your children or grandchildren or whatever, and go up into a hill and see nothing, nature in the raw. And I would argue that society does value that. And society has to do zoning. You see, these parts, let's say the wildland areas of Scotland, should have no infrastructure for renewable energy. And others, whereas some have to be sacrificial in terms of landscapes, we do need to mitigate climate change. And the seasons, the place, there's less controversy at sea, and less seabirds sometimes come in. And I think also, everyone talks about nature-based solutions. Well, there's people leap onto bandwagons. There's millions of pounds spent in restoring peat bogs, which you put eroding peat hag, you reprofile it to stop the peat eroding. Now people assume, it's very simplistic, that if you do that, you're going to benefit the climate. But also, we're the world centre of peat bogs and temperate bogs. If anywhere else in the world is to a big scale, and a bog that goes through a cycle of growth and erosion is part of the natural biodiversity of the landscape. And an eroding bog, in conservation terms, is just as valuable as a non-eroding bog, because it's part of the, and look at the cycle of the bog over thousands of years, which it does take. It's an interest, it's part of the biodiversity assessment. Now, I think a lot of action has been spent on restoring peat bogs without any evidence it's going to achieve anything for the climate. Because you just pick it up out of the air and guess and apply, because the science isn't there yet. The science hasn't caught up. And I think, again, it's decided, there needs to decide what's more important, climate change mitigation. It doesn't override everything everywhere. Or is nature conservation, keeping some parts of nature in charge, equally important, in which case we need to make sure we don't put infrastructure and climate mitigation everywhere. Otherwise you wake up with a place, you want to go for a walk in the hills, and you can't avoid seeing everything, human infrastructure everywhere. And is that a sort of planet we want to leave our grandchildren? Because the fate of us was, as humans, we're taking over the whole planet, and its rate is accelerating, and the Highlands is no different anywhere else.
Would you like to let everybody know about your book? Would you like to let everybody know about your book?
Oh, the book isn't out yet. Oh,
No,
there is a book coming out. I've got a book coming out on this sort of topic, more on the landscape change, muddled by Wiccans. It'll be coming out sometime in the next 6 months, is what I can say.
And on behalf of the Society, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to James for coming and putting on this fascinating talk, especially when the weather's so hard out there. And thank you all so much for coming as well. So here's a token of our gratitude as well. Thank you very much.